Welcome back to Behind the Educator's Lens. Every once in a while, an educator comes along whose ideas don't just change classrooms, they change the way teachers think about learning itself. Today's guest is one of those educators. Trevor MacKenzie is a classroom teacher, author, speaker, and one of the leading voices in inquiry-based learning. Based in Victoria, British Columbia, Trevor has spent years helping educators create learning experiences that encourage curiosity, student agency, and meaningful engagement. His books, including Dive into Inquiry and Inquiry Mindset, have inspired educators across British Columbia and around the world. Yet, despite the global reach of his work, Trevor remains deeply connected to the classroom, continuing to learn alongside students and teachers every day. Today, we're going beyond the books and beyond the presentations. We're exploring the experiences, relationships, and beliefs that shaped Trevor's journey and what his work can teach us all about learning, leadership, and the future of education. Trevor, welcome to Behind the Educator's Lens.
Yeah, Robin, such a joy. What a great introduction. Could we just spend more time together? Like, can you travel with me and do that introduction as I visit schools? That was so lovely to hear. And yeah, thank you for inviting me on to have this conversation. It's a joy to be here.
Well, I will clear my calendar anytime you need somebody to introduce you to the stage. I'm happy to do that for you. So I got to know Trevor actually through friends of mine. Many people that I work with know your work, but fewer people know the story behind it. Before the conferences, the books, and the international recognition, there was simply a kid growing up on Vancouver Island. Let's start there. What was life like growing up?
Yeah, well, now we're going to really pull back the layers, Robin. This is a lot of fun. So I grew up all over. I spent some time in Ontario as a kid. I grew up on the Lower Mainland a little bit, and then finally my family settled down in the Okanagan and Kelowna
Okay.
in grade 6. So finally we kind of settled down, and Kelowna was such a beautiful place to live and grow up and play sports and lake life and mountain life and school district 23, the central Okanagan was really where I became a learner, I guess you can say. And then eventually, yeah, I went to college in the Okanagan for a couple of years and transferred to the University of Victoria, where I met my lovely wife, and she's from here in Victoria. And Victoria is just such a beautiful, beautiful place that, I knew I didn't want to leave once I got here. And so I started my career here as a teacher eventually. So growing up, I'd say the most amount of time I spent in one space was the Okanagan, Kelowna, and it was such a
Nice.
great place to live. And like I said, lake summers and mountain winters, and just really, really good community. I've got dear friends who still live there, so I still call it home. Absolutely.
Do you think that you might have a special connection to places with water?
I think so. When I travel to all the places I'm privileged to be invited to, I think selfishly I want both. I want water and I want mountains. And anytime I'm landlocked, I get a little bit claustrophobic. And so the fact here in Victoria that we've got the ocean just a few minutes away, and then we've got mountains surrounding us. In the Lower Mainland, the same. I just feel so privileged and grateful to live and work on this land. So, yeah, I definitely love the ocean. Definitely love the mountains. Very fortunate.
So around those beautiful oceans, when you think over your years, were there teachers that stand out as these figures as well that you connect to in your different spaces?
Yeah, I think my early years, my formative years as a teacher, I really was lucky that I landed in a school in my practicum and eventually, got contracted work there, where the staff was just this collective, this community of practitioners that was really engaged. And I didn't know it at the time in kind of professional inquiry. We would ask big questions of ourselves, we would engage in action research, we would look at the data, we would reflect on our teaching practices, and we would come together and talk openly about them, whether it was in the staff room or at the photocopier, but also informal spaces, staff meetings and committees and department meetings. So I think my first 7 years where I was cutting my teeth as a teacher, I was just so lucky that I had those people around me. And gosh, the list is like an arm's length. Like, my teacher librarian, Jeff Orm, he's been a provincially recognized teacher librarian. Like, I'm just so lucky that I had him just down the hall. And he would always, I'd knock on his window and I'd say, do you have a minute? And he would know it was always going to be more than a minute, right? It was always going to be 10, 15 minutes of really rich discussions and conversations about how we can best meet the needs of our learners. I was surrounded by amazing coaches who had coached sport at the school for just years, and they were just so giving of their mentorship. I think that's a key piece of just healthy schools is there's a degree of mentorship, this kind of, I don't want to say responsibility, Robyn, but there's something that, teachers who have been there for a while, they find joy in the obligation. They find fulfillment in that responsibility. And I'm just so fortunate that there are so many who took the younger teachers under their wing. And now those teachers are all retired. And now it's like colleagues that I did my practicing with. Now we're the mentors to the next, wave of teachers. So I do really appreciate schools that come together with some common purposes and have conversations and that, get engaged with supporting each other, whether it's mentorship or just like, I've got you, I'm in your corner, come along this journey. It may be hard, but I'm in your corner. So early days, lots of people come to mind, Robyn, for sure.
What were your challenges as you started to step into that classroom? You mentioned cutting your teeth in the first 7 years. And what were kind of those big things that you found to be some hurdles in your first 10 years?
Yeah, engagement for sure. I think I came in with a lot of baggage around what I thought teaching looked like. In fact, my first principal, he came to my classroom when I got my contract and he said, can I help you with your classroom? Can I buy anything for you? Do you need anything? And I said, you know what I need? I need a lecture stand, one of those things that I could stand behind and talk from. And gosh,
Yeah.
like I do not need one of those. Like what I needed to do was get in the learning with the students, not to lecture at them. And so I love telling that story because it reflects the baggage that we bring into the practice and into our profession. And so I learned really early that in order to engage students, teaching wasn't what I thought it was going to be. Teaching wasn't how I was taught. I really learned from my students. They were the litmus test. I taught a lot of Indigenous students my first 10 years of teaching, and gosh, I learned so much from them about place, about asking and listening, about community, about family, and about how to create authentic learning experiences and where you really center community and place and identity in your plans and your assessments, because all the other stuff just wasn't working. And so when I think of engagement, that was a big hurdle I needed to jump over. And again, going back to that community of practitioners, the mentorship, we were all kind of in that sandbox of playfully trying to figure it out together. And that really forced me to look at the curriculum differently as well. I used to think the curriculum was like this checklist, like, okay, I got to do this and I got to do this and work through the checklist. And really when you look at the curriculum as something more malleable, something a little agile, gosh, you're so liberated to teach differently than how I thought teaching looked like and sounds like it and feels like. So yeah, looking at the curriculum differently as well really helped me shift how I was as a teacher. Does that make sense, Robyn?
That totally makes sense. And I'm curious because I know you're talking about, as educators, we change our thoughts depending on who we're with and the environment and the kids that we have. But I'm curious if there was a moment where you realized, okay, I have to change. This just isn't working if I continue to bring this baggage into teaching. Yeah, was there a key moment?
Oh, for sure. Can I say a key student? There are
Please
many
do.
key students, but I think back to a student named Garrison, and I taught Garrison for 4 years, grade 9, 10, 11, and 12. Grade 9, I tried my best, but he failed my class. And then he showed up in September, grade 10, failed my class again. Like 3 years in a row, he failed my class. And really, I had failed him 3 years in a row. And every year he was put back into my class, I'd go down to the counselor and I'd say, why are you putting Garrison with me? Like, clearly I'm not working for Garrison. And the counselor would say, Trevor, you're the only teacher that he wants to be in a class with. You're the only teacher where he's even remotely attending. And so, that really kind of threw relationship front and center for me and Garrison. Like, that's a strength that I have with Garrison. In grade 12, the same trend was showing up. He was slowly destined to fail my class. And out of
Yeah.
pure frustration, I just asked Garrison a really frank question. I said, Garrison, what do you truly love doing? Like, if I caught you doing something outside of school where you're just lost in it, what would that thing be? Because I hadn't seen him love anything I was serving up for 4 years, right? And to my surprise, Robyn, he said graffiti art. And I said, stop it. Like, tell me more about that. And he actually asked me to come with him over lunch. And we walked nearly 3 blocks away from the school to this like abandoned warehouse. And along the side of the warehouse, we're standing on railroad tracks. It was all his graffiti. It was beautiful. Like, talented. And as an English teacher, I could see symbolism. As an English teacher, I could see literary devices and theme, but I hadn't seen any of that in anything we had done for 4 years previous, 3.5 years. And so I just stopped everything with Garrison. Like, we stopped doing Shakespeare as a class. Like, I was doing Shakespeare with the rest of the class, but Garrison and I were doing this research project on graffiti art, the founding fathers of graffiti art, who and where did it begin. He wrote a persuasive letter to the local municipality trying to convince them to legalize some public spaces because he was doing something quite naughty, right? So as Garrison was doing that, I was still doing this other stuff with the 29 other kids in the class, Shakespeare and short stories. And slowly what I started to see was Garrison's not just engagement and attendance improve, but his achievement improved. He started to do better in school. And, I would boast about Garrison, in meetings and in the staff room, like Garrison he's changing, and other teachers started to show an interest in personalizing for Garrison too, like in math and art. In other classrooms, they started to try something different for Garrison as well. And so at the end of the year, like not only did Garrison pass and graduate and he looked like a changed kid, my biggest aha was like, every kid deserves a Garrison, right? Like the 29 other kids deserve more of an approach to learning that is more personalized, where I ask questions and I begin to design more for the individual. And that was like an aha moment for me. Like, Shakespeare's important and short stories are important, but there's this reciprocity that happens when we design learning with students. And when they see that they have an authentic voice at the planning table, something magical happens. And like, that's not being utopic, like something shifts. And so Garrison was like the biggest domino. And once that domino got pushed over, all these other dominoes got pushed over. And in the subsequent years, I would think in my head, we're going to do a Garrison. We're going to do a Garrison with my other classrooms. And my goal was just to provide space where throughout the year there was more opportunity for that, even if it's just a little opportunity. And then what I noticed was that little thing began to shift my teaching. I thought it was going to be a little project or a little unit, and then it just transformed how I teach and how I show up. So now there's teaching from an inquiry stance, not just an inquiry project. It's teaching with these values near and dear to my decisions and my planning. And as my North Star, those values kind of guide how I show up in the class every single day and how I visit schools. And so one student, there are many students. I have dozens and dozens of stories, but Garrison was like the tipping point for me where I was so frustrated that it forced this transformation, which I'm just so grateful for. We learn so much from our students, don't we? Like if we're open to listening and asking questions, they're the biggest accelerator for our growth and our change. Absolutely.
I love that story because I think that once you've been in teaching, everybody can think of a Garrison where you're like, you know what, I
Absolutely.
just
Yeah.
am not reaching them with my teaching. And I applaud you because I feel like that took some real bravery to be like, what I'm doing is actually not working as a professional. And sometimes we're like, I'm a professional. I know what best. But you actually took a step back from that and thought, like, what can I learn from this student? And in doing that, man, what we call this a TSN turning point.
In
A
many
teacher,
ways,
yeah.
TSN turning point for Garrison, TSN turning point for me. And
Yes.
bravery, yes, but at first it was just frustration, right? I was just so
Mhm.
tired of not being able to show up as he needed me to show up. And he was such a social student. He loved being in school, but he didn't love being in class. And so, there are all these indicators that he's got a lot of charisma, he has a lot to offer, and I'm just not meeting his needs. And I think frustration sometimes can be such an accelerator to teacher growth as well, right? Like, we just don't want to bang our head against the wall year after year after year. And again, I'm so grateful I was a part of a learning community. I had a principal who would liberate us to try different things. We had teams of teachers working together to try different things. And then when I would boast about Garrison, I had colleagues who showed interest, like, "Oh, what are you doing over there? How is that working out for you? Tell me more about that." And that interest, that curiosity led to, who knows how much impact to other students beyond Garrison, right? Just, there are conditions in schools that allow for less bravery, right? Like, do we need to show up like courageous and brave? I love that. But also, if we're just a culture of curiosity, if we just ask questions and have open conversations, that leads to, I think, yeah, quicker shift, if you will, quicker shift.
Yeah, and I think curiosity can also be a verb, right? It's something that we can do. We can ask questions and then we can learn from it if we're willing to listen.
Absolutely.
A teacher notices something that isn't working, starts asking better questions, and eventually discovers a different path. And for you, that path became inquiry. For listeners that are unfamiliar with inquiry learning, how would you describe it?
Yeah, well, I suppose I would simplify it in its, like, sharpest point, that inquiry is curiosity.
Okay.
Coming back to that verb, if we're getting our kids curious about the curriculum, we automatically are more in an inquiry stance than not. We want our students making connections to the community and to contextual relevance. We don't want students to say, "Why am I learning this? Why are we doing this?" We just want the clarity, to purpose, the why underneath the curriculum and the learning to be front and center. And then within that inquiry is curiosity. There are different things that we could do to create inquiry experiences and to teach from an inquiry stance. There are different types of inquiry as well. What's fascinating, Robyn, is the research kind of tells a tale of two stories. Inquiry can be impactful for students and it can be a hot mess for students. And what's fascinating is they're actually talking about two different things, two different types of inquiry. One is really clearly structured and really thoughtfully planned by the teacher, and the other is a little bit of a hot mess express. We ask kids these ungoogleable questions, and sometimes we give them technology and we say, "Figure it out." And that leads to students who are anxious and overwhelmed and uncertain. So coming up with a common definition for schools, it's really important. And just to demuddy the waters, if we can just simplify it, of, am I getting kids curious about the curriculum? Am I showing them the greater purpose, the why underneath this? Am I explicit with that? I think we're already teaching from an inquiry stance to a certain degree. Does that make sense?
That totally makes sense. And I'm curious, what would be then some common misconceptions that you come across when you're talking about inquiry? Because that dichotomy of, yeah, it can be a hot mess express. I've heard that quite a bit. And then I've also heard the structured information as well. So what's happening there to kind of separate rather than bring us together?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, if we can imagine, a swimming pool that has varying depths, you start in the shallow end and you slowly get to the deeper end, right? And the deep end is what we call free inquiry, where students have a lot of choice, a lot of agency to co-design the learning. And one of the biggest misconceptions I see from teachers globally is that inquiry is merely the deep end. Like, inquiry means we got to give kids this, deep choice, deep agency. And for the most part, students flounder there because it's really could be overwhelming. The bright, shiny light of agency and choice and independence, it can be really overwhelming for a lot of students. And so if we can imagine different types of inquiry where slowly there's a gradual release of responsibility over the learning, where in the shallower end of inquiry, we're able to model certain structures and routines, certain thinking patterns and competencies. And then slowly students become more competent in taking on more agency over learning. So That would be a big one. When I visit schools globally, when we look at that swimming pool image and we think about these four types of inquiry, teachers feel so relieved that they don't have to get to the deep end too fast or too soon. Or maybe the deep end isn't even the goal. Maybe a goal is just a change in agency over time to empower our students. So, for listeners, if you were thinking inquiry is the same thing, that deep end free inquiry, that's the hot mess we want to avoid without that really explicit planning and modeling over time. And that gradual shift of responsibility over learning, for some classrooms, it could take months, right? You could plan your whole school year around this gradual change shift in responsibility over learning. And in doing so, your students are going to benefit. We go slow to go far, and we don't kick them into the deep end too fast or too soon. So I'd encourage teachers to think of it like that swimming pool kind of analogy of differing depths reflecting differing levels of agency over learning for our students.
I love that analogy of the swimming pool. Again, you're a water boy. I love it. I love it because that totally makes sense to me. And I think it makes sense to a lot of people. If you're in the shallow end, you can maybe touch the bottom. You can, move around a little bit easier. And then as you get further and further into that pool, you're required to have more skills to stay afloat, right?
Yeah, and let's be really explicit there, Robyn. Forgive me for interrupting, but when you say have more skills to be able to float and swim, in British Columbia, those are our core competencies and our curricular competencies, right? That the skills of learning, the how of learning, and slowly as our students are explicitly shown those and we talk about them and they reflect on them, slowly it's those skills that they're flexing almost like learning muscles, right? To help them get across the pool. And in the shallow end, a lot of these skills perhaps are new to students. Those are the particular skills they need to take on agency over learning. So, in terms of the BC curriculum, it's so ripe for inquiry, in part because of those curricular competencies and our core competencies. Those kind of bundle up together to create the skill set students need to take on agency over learning, ownership over learning. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I'm wondering, is there like a favorite way that you like to get people started in the shallow end with the structured inquiry? Like, is there a question that you use or a way to bring people together?
Yeah, for sure. So one of the early moves we need to make is we need to plan something called provocation. And provocation can be in many forms. It could be a provocative image, a video, an experience, a field trip can be a provocation. But the intention of a provocation is not to like provoke or poke our students, it's to provoke curiosity about the curriculum. So we plan an early experience in a unit of study where we're trying to get them curious about the curriculum, about the unit of study, whatever the big ideas or the curricular focus is. And then once we have them curious, a byproduct of their curiosity are going to be some student generated questions. Once we have them asking questions, we could start to plan with those questions to a certain degree. We can start to kind of cherry pick a few of those questions to plan lessons around. In the shallow end, planning provocation is important. And then like choose one question that you want the whole class to explore together. And I'm pointing at me, right? Like we designed that overarching umbrella question. We designed kind of the learning pathway in the shallow end, and their curiosities they're going to see are answered in that structured inquiry through your rich and explicit planning. So later on in the deeper end, it's their questions that will shape some of the learning. But in the shallow end, it should be the teacher, right? Like design that umbrella question, that overarching question, and then design provocation to get questions towards that vision, that overarching question. Provocation is something we're going to revisit across the pool. So it's never something we just do at the start of the year and then, oh, did that thing. That was a fun lesson. Now let's get into the real teaching. Provocation, something that we're going to revisit across the school year and even across a unit of study. We want to kind of spiral back to showing our kids why the learning matters. Now, provocation, we could sit in that one for the rest of the conversation today, right? Because it is one of the moves we need to make early and sharpen and do well, because just because we show a video or an image doesn't mean it gets kids curious about the curriculum, right? So really pinpointing how do I get kids curious about something where perhaps they show little excitement for or they don't understand the importance of. That's where we sit around the planning table and we begin to discuss what a provocation might be. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Do you have a favorite provocation that you've seen that lights kids up?
Yeah, it depends on a number of things. And this is what we kind of bring to the planning table. It depends first and foremost around, well, what are our curricular objectives? Like, what do I want to get them curious about? So the very first thing we think about when we're planning provocation is look at your curricular standards, look at your content standards and your big ideas, and really begin to think about, okay, with this in mind, what might I bring to the table? Secondly, we need to think about the kids. Like, I could show a provocation to 17-year-olds that I could never show to 7-year-olds, right? And not only because of the prior knowledge that 17-year-olds are bringing into the classroom, but also, that the 7-year-olds, the little hearts, like I don't want to overwhelm them, right? And then when we think about our students, not just cognitively and social emotionally, we think about their identities, like their stories, where they're from, who their families are, and as we get to know our students, we begin to determine, well, what's a good provocation for this age group and the kids in front of me? And then thirdly, another ingredient with powerful provocation planning is we want to bake in some physical movement. Like, we don't want kids just sitting in their chairs at their desks and we're trying to get them curious. We want them sharing their curiosities around the room. We want some mobilization of the curiosities. And the research tells us curiosity, it's like a campfire. Like, if you get one person curious, it kind of other people want to be around that person. And so you want to plan for some physical movement around the room. So when you say, do I have a favorite provocation? Well, those three elements need to be in play. And then the provocation could look like and sound like and feel like many different things. Images, I love images. If I have a bias, images are a favorite provocation. I've worked with a school district in Northern Canada for about 4 years, and we really believe in land being a provocation and getting kids onto the land as part of the learning cycle experience. And gosh, it's amazing what kids notice, what they begin to make connections towards, what questions surface when you get outside the walls of your classroom. So again, provocation, I've got loads of favorites, but what I don't want to do is have teachers miss the mark with those three planning features: curriculum, identity, and physical movement. If we nail those, then we could do a lot of different things with provocation to make sure that the provocation lands.
Curriculum, identity, physical movement.
Yeah. And the physical movement means collaboration, right? It's not just that we get our kids standing and moving around. When they're physically moving, they're more fruitfully collaborating and sharing their ideas, their prior knowledge. And that begins to create a community experience rather than this siloed experience of kids in their desks thinking, alone. It begins to create a bit of a momentum in the learning that allows our formative assessment to just be very different. We see the learning before us because the learning is somewhat mobilized. So the physical movement, it's just not about getting kids on their feet. That has good aspects to it. It's about creating the conditions for more collaboration.
I love that. And you mentioned in there formative assessment and how it changes your assessment practices when you create these conditions for them to mobilize their knowledge.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, how do you capture that?
Yeah. Well, let's just create two examples and then we could talk about capturing it. Example one is I collect some evidence of learning and I take it home with me and I do something with it, right? I give it formative feedback, let's say. That's one thing that we all have to do from time to time. The other experience is watching learning in real time, like watching kids physically moving around the room, sharing their ideas, even documenting their thinking around the room on anchor charts or whiteboards. And seeing that in real time, I'm able to give real time feedback. And we know that type of feedback has a much bigger impact on student growth and reflection than the previous one I described. So then how do I capture that? Now that I've got this scenario over here, how do I capture that? One way I capture that is I take field notes. Like, I actually am observing the learning and I have a notebook and I'm watching students and I'm very intentional with what I'm watching for, i.e. the curricular competencies. And I'm looking for evidence across proficiency based on what I'm seeing. So field notes are really important. In Australia, this is so adorable. They call their field notes jottings. Isn't that cute? They're just taking little jottings, watching the students in learning. Now, can we get jottings and field notes from every single student in every single class? It's pretty much impossible. I'll get field notes for a few students. So another form is student self-assessment. Like, get them to reflect on their learning in real time at the end of a class, maybe as an exit ticket. And then we confer with that data to see if we agree with it in terms of its accuracy. Like, just because a student self-assesses doesn't mean it's accurate, right? Or doesn't mean it's valid.
True.
We actually need to look at the data to confer with the data. So field notes are really helpful. Student self-assessments are really helpful. And then end of day reflections are really helpful. And when I say end of day reflections, I don't mean the kids. I mean me. At the end of the day, before I dismiss, myself from the day job, I do some reflecting and some assessing at the end of the day based on what I recall and what I saw, and maybe what the evidence around my classroom is showing me my students are at currently. Now, I prefer doing a 15, 20-minute, that type of reflection at the end of the day, rather than collecting all that stuff that I got to take home and mark with me into the evening, right? And so what is more helpful for student learning? I'd say the scenario I just described, rather than me taking the evidence home with me and marking it in isolation without the students. The documentation is really important. I just want to highlight a few ways we're documenting: the field notes, the student self-assessments, the end of the day reflection, and then the visible evidence of learning around our room: whiteboards, anchor charts. We could take photos of that and put it right in the LMS, right into a student report, right into a Google slide. The documentation of learning is another space where we capture some of that formative evidence. Does that make sense, Robyn?
Yeah, that totally makes sense. And I've heard the phrase triangulation of evidence, but that's almost sounds like a square where we've
Yeah,
got 4 points that we're looking for, which I like. And I like that idea of taking photos of the evidence around the room at the end of the day and intentionally offshooting that into some type of system, whatever it is that you use. Maybe it's Spaces or whatever data program that you have, or even shooting that off to parents so that they can
absolutely.
also
Yeah.
continue the inquiry at home.
Yeah. And sometimes we hear from teachers, from parents, how's my child doing? Like, I'm not seeing enough grades, or I'm not seeing enough numbers or percentages. Like, how's my child doing? And gosh, in that after school reflection, if I fire off a little bit of an email with a photo occasionally, or if I invite parents to see some of that evidence and documentation that I'm reflecting on, parents are less likely to be in the dark. They're more likely to be in the know. And then the conversations at home aren't about the numbers, they're about the evidence of learning. Like, a parent will see a photo in an email and say at the dinner table, oh, tell me about the lesson today, or tell me about that thing you did with Mr. MacKenzie, or what you created in school today. It's not just about how was school today or how are you doing in school. It's about the learning experiences and engagement that their child is a part of. So maybe teachers add in that email to parents, right? Maybe in your daily reflections, every so often, you may fire off an email to a specific parent, or you might fire off an email to all your parents. But every so often, I think that's a really important, pathway to inform parents of how their child or their student is doing at school.
And then they can help provide some experiences maybe out in the world too that might encourage them to keep learning beyond the classroom walls.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
One thing I appreciate a lot about your work is that while it has reached educators around the world, it has always remained grounded in British Columbia classrooms. So I'd like to spend a few minutes celebrating the place where so much of this journey began. As a educator who now works and impacts schools internationally, we'd love to hear your perspectives on education here at home. What do you think makes BC educators so unique?
Yeah. Oof. I'd love to just simplify it and say there's something in the water. But honestly, I think there's something about our teacher professional, programs, our certifications, and our higher ed, our post-secondary institutions. Gosh, I know some amazing profs doing amazing work. And when I said that I came in with a lot of learning baggage and teaching baggage, I do think that shifted. I see a lot of new teachers more aware of inquiry, more aware of place-based learning, more aware of Indigenous ways of knowing than, gosh, 30 years ago. So I do think our post-secondary institutions are leading the way globally in terms of, yeah, getting young teachers ready. I do think our redesigned curriculum is world class. And I'm able to see spaces and curricula globally that allows for inquiry and differentiation and personalization to happen more fruitfully. And our curriculum is just like so right for this type of work. In part, Robyn, because of the big ideas. Many schools struggle to teach to big ideas because there are so many content standards in the curriculum or prescribed learning outcomes. And when the learning becomes so prescribed and topical and surface area, it's harder to go deeper. And so our big ideas are so helpful. Our curricular competencies and our core competencies are really showing us what is of equal importance to the content. The content's important and the skills are important. So I'd have to say our redesigned curriculum, and then our BC K-12 reporting policy framework. In terms of assessment, it's such a powerful document. I've shared it with schools around the world who have taken the document and made it their own, because they just see how important the assessment conversation is, to not just support student growth, but to have teachers teach differently. We need to be liberated from certain old assessment beliefs, and that assessment policy is world class. And then I think of just when I visit BC schools, Robyn, like there's just this openness to sitting around the table and having a conversation. Like if we could just simplify it to that, like teachers in BC just seem a little bit more open to having conversations about teaching and learning than in a lot of other spaces. When you enter a robust room or like a stuffy room, and there's a lot less stuffy rooms in British Columbia, maybe there's a joy for learning, or maybe there's a connectedness that we bring to, the staff room or to our school communities. But just, yeah, really, really lovely to visit schools and spaces where teachers are just open to have a gab about our practice. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and for years, I think I heard the new curriculum, and it's not new here anymore, and I'm not hearing that as much anymore. And I wonder if we're now in the place where we have done that full circle of moved from prior systems to the curricular competencies and to the core competencies, and teachers have now grown up with that. So the teachers that are coming in were the kids who experienced that as well.
Yeah, my sons are 13 and 17, and the redesigned curriculum is something that, my eldest son saw launch. And it was amazing for both boys just to see how quickly they picked up on reflection and self-assessment, how they begin to use the language of the competencies, core and curricular, when they talk about their learning. And yes, the content is important, but there are these other bits and bobs that are, gosh, the transferable skills that they can take to other settings, whether it's sports or families or friends or future careers. It was really wonderful to see both of my sons so quickly adopt that level of reflection and metacognition. And my sons aren't special. Like, all of the children who have grown up with this redesigned curriculum have had rich opportunities to reflect on learning that our previous curriculum documentation didn't allow, in part because of how many prescribed learning outcomes they were. When you have 150 prescribed learning outcomes, you're just on a treadmill of teaching. You're on this treadmill of, I got to get the kids through this content. And now that there's a little bit less of the prescribed learning outcomes and more of an emphasis on the curricular competencies and the core competencies, I think we're seeing the level of reflection and metacognition in our students. We're not seeing a decrease in literacy scores or numeracy scores. We're not seeing a decrease in students being accepted to post-secondary institutions. Like, the hard data isn't negatively affected, by this redesigned curriculum. I think if anything, the slowest kind of momentum has been teachers teaching differently to the redesigned curriculum. It's not just a new curriculum, it's a new opportunity for us to teach perhaps to the garrisons a little bit more, and to perhaps to curiosity a little bit more. So if there's been a slowness to adopting the curriculum, it's mostly us shifting how we teach to really leverage the beauty in the redesigned curriculum. It sounds like the Ministry of Education is like paying me to say this, right? And so just to pull back the layers, Robyn, I get to visit schools globally that don't have
Yes.
a curriculum like we have. And then I get to see, other schools and organizations look at the BC curriculum and say, we need to do something like that. Like the Northwest Territories adopted our curriculum, right? The Northwest Territories Yukon's taking the BC curriculum. There are other provinces who are looking at what we're doing here and saying, we want more of that. And that's a beautiful feeling to know that we're in such a precious space and proudly looked upon space by other people. It really, yeah, sheds light on the good things that are happening in BC.
I thank you so much for sharing that global perspective and how Canada is even transforming as we work alongside one another. You are a person that exudes joy, and I think you've been in the system for a little while. So, how can educators sustain joy in such
Ooh.
a demanding profession?
Yeah. Oh, that's a good question. Yeah, my 24th year of teaching, I suppose, yeah, I've got to take care of myself. And that looks, different for every person, right? But, when I'm dysregulated, guess who's dysregulated? My students, right? And we walk into a building, some of our schools, like my high school, is 1,400 kids, right? So you walk into a building with that level of energy. And if I'm not doing the self-care, it's going to show up in how I teach. So whether that's health, exercise, nutrition, family time, time in the ocean or along the beaches, right? Whatever you do to fill your cup outside of school is important. And then, I spend the most amount of time in my day in a school. Like I want the school experience to be joyful. So planning learning experiences that provide some fulfillment, right? And what are practices that are rich in curiosity, both for the kids and for you. We've talked a lot about curiosity for the kids, but I have to say a tipping point in schools is when teachers are curious together about their teaching practice. And simultaneously, adjacent to that curiosity are more joyful teachers. They like being in those spaces of high curiosity and they're joyful spaces. So, fun learning isn't trivial. It's not like the afterthought. It's let's put that at the center of the learning planning. And so many other good things happen. Achievement will increase. I think sustainability and stamina for teachers will be better. So I suppose two things, one being take care of ourselves as much as we can so we show up our best selves. And then in the classroom, centering curiosity and joy, both for students, but also for us.
That is some sage wisdom to keep us in the game for the long run. Finally, where can people continue learning from you and following your work?
Oh, that's kind. I have a website, trevormackenzie.com. So that's a space full of resources and, the current happenings of these conversations. Instagram and LinkedIn. I'm very active on both Instagram and LinkedIn at Trev_MacKenzie. And both of those spaces, I share examples of this conversation kind of in classrooms, right? And so, when we have these beautiful conversations, a lot of teachers say, I want to know what that looks like he talked about curiosity and provocation. Show me an example. And gosh, just being able to share videos and photos from classrooms globally where these practices are really taught and shown on Instagram and LinkedIn. I think those are two spaces I'd encourage listeners to go and have a look at.
And I'm sure they will. Trevor, thank you for joining us today. Your work continues to challenge educators to think differently about learning while reminding us that curiosity remains one of the most powerful forces in education. As a fellow British Columbian, it's inspiring to see someone from Victoria making such meaningful impact around the world while remaining deeply connected to students and teachers. So thank you so much for sharing your story with us today. And I feel very privileged to have spent this time with you. So thank you so much, Trevor.
Likewise, Robyn. Thank you for having me. Gosh, I appreciate you.
I appreciate you. Next time on Behind the Educator's Lens.